The fight for civil rights may seem like a chapter in the history books, but all across the South, there are living, breathing stories of incredible courage and extraordinary resilience in the face of ongoing injustice. Welcome to Southern Gumption. I'm your host, Andy Lee. The South is the battleground for voting rights. While legislators across state lines have been trying to make it harder to vote, there have been everyday people working tirelessly to help their communities get to the ballot box. Voting Rights Renaissance will profile the work of organizations across the South who are transforming challenges into opportunities for connection and collective action. In election season, there's one phrase that pops up no matter the party you vote for, no matter the candidate you support.
Get out and vote.
Get out and vote.
Come out and vote.
Come out and vote!
At the end of the day, it's sort of what we're all here for, making the act of getting to the ballot box and casting your vote as easy as possible. But easy looks different for everyone.
My name is Dom Kelly. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I am the co-founder and CEO of New Disabled South. We are the first and only regional disability organization in the United States. What that means is that we do this work through a multi-state lens because we see an opportunity for movement in the South, and there is an opportunity to actually tangibly improve the lives of disabled people if we look at this work through that multi-state lens. There have always been barriers to voting for disabled people. Main kind of things that we've seen are polling place and accessibility. I think the stat is like only 16% of in-person polling places are actually fully accessible in this country. And that is with federal law that is supposed to make sure that polling places are accessible. So most elections are not actually adhering to the ADA, to the Help America Vote Act, to the Voting Rights Act, like all where there are standards in place for the way that voting is supposed to happen and what's available to all voters. So it's polling place and accessibility. It's the inaccessibility of absentee and mail voting, the varied laws around absentee and mail voting, depending on which state you live in, or even sometimes depending on which county you live in, where you can bring your absentee ballot, what time you can bring it, if you can put it in a drop box, or if you have to buy a stamp, or if you need to, sign it and they match your signature, like all of the things that may or may not come into play depending on the laws. Those can be barriers to a person depending on who they are and their disability. People show up to the polls and there is not sufficient accessible voting machines, or the only accessible voting machine is down, and they're not able to access it. People show up to the polls and there are hours long lines, and like here in the state of Georgia, you can only skip to the front of the line. You can skip to the front of the line if you're disabled or if you're above the age of 75, but only between the hours of 9:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. And I think the Secretary of State, I would guess would probably say, well, who's going to turn somebody away if they need to go to the front of the line and they're using a mobility aid? Well, that's not the point. The point is, why is the law such that you can only skip the line in these hours? Why do you put hours? And I think those are the kinds of things that disenfranchise people, and people use the term apathy, but I don't think there are apathetic voters. I think there are voters who have just been continuously disenfranchised.
I'm Jenny McKenny. I'm the North Carolina coordinator for Vote Riders, and we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with a mission of making sure that every eligible citizen is able to cast their ballot and have it count, regardless of whether they live in a state with a voter ID law.
Voter ID in North Carolina has a storied history, and one that a lot of different orgs, including SDSJ, are sort of the toxic X of voter ID in North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about, or explain to people who might not be as plugged in, what that history is?
Of course. I think it's important to start with the Shelby County v. Holder decision that opened the door for these laws to really proliferate across the country.
Shelby County v. Holder was a historic case for voting rights. Before 2013, states with a history of voter discrimination had to get pre-clearance from federal court before changing their voter laws. In 2013, the United States Supreme Court decided in Shelby County v. Holder that that requirement was unconstitutional. Within 24 hours, states started putting voter ID laws back into place, including North Carolina.
And we see in North Carolina that the first attempt was directly via the state legislature, and then we saw that didn't work. It got struck down as being racist with its intent, not just its impact. And so that went away. And when North Carolina brought this voter ID law back up as a constitutional amendment that was put directly to North Carolinian voters to decide on, North Carolinian voters voted that they did want voter ID. And the legislature got to decide how that was implemented, what IDs would be accepted, what alternatives voters would have. And I think whenever North Carolinian voters voted for this amendment, they look on the surface and it seems to make sense that you should prove who you are to vote. But that was not a concern in America until lies began to be told about our elections' integrity and about voter fraud. Mm-hmm. And the reality of voter ID laws is that they disenfranchise many, many eligible voters who do not have an ID, who cannot easily get an ID, who do not have the information about alternatives, even from poll workers when they go to vote, don't get the information they need to cast a ballot that counts, despite being an eligible U.S. citizen.
What is the current status of voter ID in North Carolina? What forms are acceptable, and what are the ways that people who don't have IDs currently have to navigate?
There is a list of acceptable IDs that you can find on the State Board of Elections website, but the main forms of ID that most people are going to use are North Carolina ID or driver's license if they have it. If not, there are some other options. Many student IDs and employee IDs were approved by the Board of Elections, but not all, and so it's important that people check on that. Folks can use a U.S. passport or passport card, a military ID, or a veteran's health card. Voters have options in North Carolina. They do, and there are still many, many voters who don't have anything on that list. And we hear that a lot. Even in more progressive spaces, we hear everybody has an ID. It's easy to get. North Carolina has a no-fee state ID that you can get. Well, that's a little bit misleading when you consider that you still have to present a birth certificate. You still have to present your Social Security card, and many voters are going to have to pay to get those things. You don't have to pay for a Social Security card, but you have to get transportation to the office. So even the no-fee ID is not free, and you have to be able to get off work or get away from family responsibilities to go to these appointments. And above all, you just have to be able to navigate bureaucracy. Yeah. Everybody hates the DMV. I have a driver's license. I've had one since I was 16. I hate the DMV. Nobody wants to go to the DMV. Yeah. And the pandemic kind of exacerbated the issues that people had with DMV wait times, difficulty getting appointments. And then we also have natural disasters that have come into our state on the East Coast and now in the West that have contributed to people losing those underlying documents that they need to get an ID.
Right.
And so there are just a lot of barriers that even folks who know the harms of voter ID laws and care about the people impacted just don't realize are such big barriers.
In North Carolina, if you don't have an approved photo ID, you can fill out an ID exception form when you go to vote. You share some details about why you don't have an ID, either a disability or illness, work or school schedules, or your photo ID was lost, stolen, or misplaced, and you can still vote provisionally and have your ballot counted. But SCSJ and its partners heard several reports of voters struggling to get or even being refused ID exception forms on Election Day.
Yeah, I think 2020 it was important because it did expand absentee voting for people in places where there was none or it wasn't available to them. And so I think, yeah, in ways we still have some expansion of absentee voting in some places. I think that we have seen some like curbside voting pop up here and there in certain states. We've seen like just a little bit more flexibility in how people vote in general, and I think maybe even more of a willingness to um, figure out solutions because elections administrators had to find solutions to problems during the height of a pandemic. And so I think maybe at the elections administration level, like county level or whoever's administering elections, like there is, and this is coming from my having like talked to elections administrations officials and people who actually run and implement elections, that like there is more of a willing openness to kind of thinking about how they can do things differently, be more accommodating. That said, though, I think there are more barriers than there have been, expansion, unfortunately. And that's just simply been because of, lies about widespread voter fraud and just the continuation of voter suppression efforts in a new way. So, yeah, while I think it did give more opportunity in 2020 for people to vote, I think a lot of like, and that has continued in some ways. It has become more difficult to vote in new ways because of like some of the lies that we've been told about the outcome of the election.
And I have a couple of examples of specific barriers that certain populations face. And one of those is voters who are unhoused. Voters who are unhoused don't have a safe place to keep their social security card, their ID, their driver's license, or birth certificate. A lot of times they don't have a safe place to keep those. So when one gets stolen, it all gets stolen. How do you replace your birth certificate if you don't have an ID? How do you get your ID if you can't get your birth certificate? I'm assisting a voter now, have been assisting her for months. She's needs to change the spelling of her name on her birth certificate because for some reason her birth certificate has a slightly different spelling of her name than her social security card. Now, she has a New York driver's license, but she can't use that for voter ID in North Carolina because she registered way ahead of the election. So she needs a North Carolina driver's license for her everyday life, and she needs something to vote. And she thought that she was going to have to go to court to get her birth certificate amended. When is she going to find the time to do that? Is she going to try to hire a lawyer? Is she going to spend money thinking that she has to do that? To me, it doesn't make sense. The hoops that people have to jump through, and you can't think about them. You won't think of them. It's hard to imagine the barriers to getting an ID and the very special, unique circumstances that people have that they don't know how to navigate. And if they're elderly or like really anybody who doesn't feel the most comfortable navigating technology, it's going to be really difficult to find the information you need to be able to get over that barrier through that hoop.
If you were talking to an average voter who isn't plugged into these issues, isn't plugged into this work, what are some trends or issues that you see regionally that you would want them to be aware of and be plugged into when it comes to accessibility in elections?
The main one that we're seeing in the South has been this criminalizing voter assistance with absentee voting. I have unfortunately not seen enough press, enough attention on this. And I think I would want people to know that this is happening, not just disabled people, but folks all across our region, because this is this is scary. It's now felony for people to receive assistance voting in a number of states in the South, including Alabama just this year, Louisiana just this year, Georgia after the passage of SB 202 a couple of years ago, Mississippi signed into law, which was actually struck down by the court, thankfully, but makes it a felony for someone to receive assistance with filling out or returning their absentee ballot unless that person is like a direct family member. Sometimes the law in each state varies a little, but it's not entirely clear. This is a way that our lawmakers who do not believe in democracy are able to weaponize this method of accessible voting against people who may not have a family member that takes care of them, right? There are people who live in nursing homes who might have 3 or 4 rotating people who take care of them every day. If that person helps them with returning their ballot, they both could be charged with a felony. That stops people from wanting to vote. And I had a conversation with a particular person who helps run elections here in Georgia, who told me, well, no one ever goes after folks for that. So basically they should just do it and, apologize later. It's like, we're talking about felony charges. This is not something that anybody wants to mess around with. And this is something we've heard from people that they're afraid about. And so I'd want people to know that these kinds of things are happening. We hear about things like, in Georgia, it's illegal to hand out food and water to voters in line. Like, those are kind of like the sexy things, not sexy, but you know what I mean? Like, those are the things that make the headlines. And we don't hear about the ban on private funding for elections. We don't hear about the felony charges for voter assistance. And I'd want people to know this is happening so we can then mobilize people to write to their electeds, show up during legislative session, demand that these types of laws, which skirt by, they'll shove them in another bill, or they'll do it in the dead of night, pass it in the dead of night, or sign it into law. Like, these are the things that people don't see enough. So I'd want people to get involved in these kind of things that don't make the big headlines.
How is Vote Riders helping voters navigate these barriers? What are some of the programs and ways that they are doing that?
We have a helpline that voters can call or text year-round, not just in presidential election years, and can ask us voter ID questions, can also request help getting their ID or their driver's license. And virtually any barrier that a voter has, our staff and our dedicated volunteers are going to work with them to find the solution, find where they even need to begin, and how to get them to the DMV with an ID in their hand at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And we assist voters with DMV appointments to get that. We get transportation to those appointments, as well as to the Social Security Administration if they've lost their Social Security card. We also have pro bono attorneys ready to help voters request their birth certificates if they can't get it any other way. We also have a special program and partnerships for trans and non-binary voters to assist with the cost of a legal name change and gender marker updates so that they have an ID that when they go to the polls to exercise their right to vote, that they have a more comfortable interaction with the poll worker because they have an ID who accurately represents who they are and they're not going to be dead named out loud publicly. Mm-hmm. We also partner with shelters, diaper banks, food banks, try to meet people where they are and understand that their primary reason for getting an ID may not be voting. Mm-hmm. And that's okay, because our mission is to make sure they have what they need to vote. So yes, we get the voters that we assist, we will follow up and get them a ride to the polls. And we like to think of it kind of as an invitation to folks who are not perhaps as engaged by other community partners because folks don't think that they're going to be interested in voting, that that their survival needs come before that. And that may be true for a lot of voters, that, housing or employment are the top things on their mind, and voting is not making the cut as far as a priority for their resources. But if we invite folks into the process and say, your vote matters, we want you to get out and we want you to vote so that you have a voice in those things that are impacting your survival. I think that's somewhere that vote riders at this intersection of voting rights and voter enfranchisement and direct service providing, in the sense of we're giving something that assists in other areas of their life. I think that is a really unique value add, not just to the voting rights space, but to voters' lives.
Can you talk a little bit about what New Disabled South is doing in 2024?
Yeah, absolutely. We're doing a lot right now. We've been talking to voters since the summer. We've gone to some congregate settings, like nursing facilities, places where, canvassers are not knocking on doors there to get them materials, like registered some voters, help them understand where to vote, how to vote, all the laws around voting. We have gathered voters from different demographics. We had events for young disabled voters. We did a whole political education series that was virtual, to get all of our community to understand the laws around voting, to understand the issues. We also have been doing some making sure that the way that we talk about voting, and also some of the issues like ballot measures and things, are written in plain language. So we've developed a tool that actually has all of the ballot measures in our southern states in plain language for folks to go read before they go vote on a ballot measure. And then we've just been really trying to mainly make sure that our community has the information that they need to vote. We are working on some legislation starting here in Georgia post-election to codify some protections into state law for disabled voters, some standards for voting. And we hope to be able to introduce similar legislation in other states, but we're starting in Georgia, where I live, and really wanting to make sure that, because yes, we have federal law, but it's not being followed, or elections aren't being run properly, or there's no funding for improved accessibility or poll worker training or things like that. That's kind of the things that we're trying to codify into law, and also make sure that there's funding for, so that we can maybe see less barriers in future elections.
Yeah. SCSJ, we do a lot of work on the election administration and election protection side. And it's such an deeply unsexy issue to try to get people to care about. Yep. Hey, it's not exciting, but if you want the election run right, these are the ways, and these are the people, and these are the things you have to have there. And if only 3 retirees work at this voting site, then probably it's not going to run as effective as possible.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And there's virtually no funding for improved poll worker training. In the 2020 election, we saw some private funding that went to improving accessibility and improving education around accessibility for workers. Now there are laws in states like Georgia that actually make it a felony for elections administration to receive private funding from foundations and things like that. And from the data that we have, most of that funding went to accessibility. So what we've been worried about is the closing of polling places, because they will say that it's not ADA accessible, rather than find the money, invest in making it accessible. So yeah, now we have you can't even get the money in the ways that we saw in 2020. So that's an issue that we're tracking, and we're hoping to be able to at least in states that have outlawed that private funding, maybe see a carve out for accessibility of polling places.
One of my takeaways from kind of going back to COVID was looking at all of these ways that people tried to make elections more accessible, and then tying that into I'm from Boone, and seeing sort of the outpouring and the way that people are jumping over hoops to try to get people to be able to cast their ballots through absentee or through some other effort after being hit by Helene. Seeing people go out of their way to do that, there's always a voice in my back of my head of like, this is great, but if this is okay, why is this not the norm? Like, why can't we always try to jump and go out of our way to make it as accessible as this?
Yeah, well, and I think disabled people have been saying that not just about voting, but like, in 2020, everybody went remote, everyone went virtual. Events were virtual, workplaces are virtual. And I don't know how many disabled people who were like, hi, I tried to work at your company and asked for remote as an accommodation, and you denied me that accommodation, and now everyone's remote. This event was always in person and now it's hybrid, or like, why couldn't this have happened before? And that's usually how it goes. It usually, unfortunately, takes some kind of disaster or some kind of thing that impacts people who are not disabled for folks to jump into action and do things that are not, quote unquote, the norm to accommodate people. And so I think we would be much better off if accessibility was thought of from the start rather than after something that necessitates it happens. And that's the case with hurricane relief efforts, and that's not just voting. Like, the fact that there is not better infrastructure in place or planning and preparation for hurricanes. It's like, why are we now going in after the fact to try to help people when some of this could have been avoided in the first place if there were more funds for infrastructure and all those things. So yeah, I think it is incredibly frustrating, and my hope that like maybe folks can start to learn about why it's critical for us to think about access from the start.
I have been asking people about sort of the motivating moments or things that make the work worthwhile. And I think specifically now that we are after the election, I think it's very worthwhile to ask, in the work that you do, what are the interactions, conversations, or what are the specific moments that you've had with people that when you're feeling depressed, when you're feeling downtrodden, when you're feeling defeated, you go back to and you go, oh, that was a win. That was a win, and that was great.
Yeah, actually just like right before we hopped on to record this, somebody that I know posted on Facebook that she's a disabled voter, Black woman, tried to vote early for 3 days. And when she showed up at her polling places, they wouldn't accommodate her disability. She wound up having to drive 20 minutes out of the way to another polling location in her county, and had to actually cite federal law that they needed to accommodate her disability for her to actually be able to vote. While nobody should have to go through all of those barriers, that part is like deeply enraging. It does give me hope that people are like, no, I got to vote. Like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it despite this. And I'm going to pull out my knowledge of law, right? And I'm going to like show them this is why my disability has to be accommodated. And this is what I need to be able to vote. And I'm entitled to this. And I think that tells me that the efforts that, like, even if we can't change right now in this moment, the education of our poll workers, if we can't change the way that elections administrators actually set up and administer elections, like, we at the very least can educate our community to know what they're entitled to, what their rights are, and they can show up and demand that they be able to cast their vote. And that gives me hope. Again, shouldn't have to be that way, but it gives me hope that people want to vote that much that they'll do what they need to do, and they're come armed with the information.
I think a lot about the voter who I'm assisting with the birth certificate amendment. I think about my first conversation with her where she said she thought she needed to go to court and how elated she was to find out that not only did she not have to go to court, but I could find the form she needed to fill out. I could give her the instructions. I could pay the fee because she's on a fixed income. She doesn't have transportation, so for us to be able to get her a lift is fantastic. I think those one-on-one interactions with voters who had no idea how they were going to overcome the barriers, and we can come in and say, we have the solutions.
Yeah.
We're here for you. We want you to participate in our democracy. Tell people all the time, they come up and they say, who are you voting for? Who are you campaigning for? Nobody. I'm campaigning for everybody to vote, because a democracy can only be a democracy, can only be a government by the people, for the people, if the people vote.
Yeah.
And there are people trying to keep you from voting, so I'm here to counteract that.
The only person I'm campaigning for is you.
Right.
Thank you for listening to Southern Gumption. If you like this episode, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. Make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on an episode. Be sure to follow New Disabled South and Vote Riders for more information about what they do. You can find out more about SCSJ and the work that we do at southerncoalition.org. Find us on Twitter at SCSJ or Instagram at SCSJofficial. I'm Andy Lee, and this has been Southern Gumption. For the South, by the South.